So, I want to welcome you all into the conversation that Andrew and I have been having about this conversation. That we've been talking about the extraordinary possibilities of the interweaving of the insights of two extremely important vocations, that both of which we mutually acknowledge as being extremely important. That Andrew's life vocation of philosophy and my life vocation, in a sense, of politics and public policy and attempting to intervene, as was pointed out, the ability to intervene in events going on in the world with some prospect, at least some perceived prospect, of being able to make things better, to achieve a good that is obviously in comparison to something else. And as Andrew has pointed out, the danger of this, and I heard what you're saying is that to, in a sense, totalize reality itself, so as to give yourself some sort of a map or overall phenomenological manifestation of reality, that you feel that you can, with some proper trepidation, but at least with adequate confidence, that you can move things in a direction that definitely has an overtone of it, of manipulation, of controlling, of causing things to occur in a way that would be different than if you had not intervened, is what one is clearly engaged in doing. Now, it constantly harbors the threat, and we've talked about this, is that it constantly harbors the threat of ultimately being totalitarian, because it carries with it a certain sense of righteousness, a certain sense of a postulate of reality, in accordance with which other people's conduct is measured as appropriate or inappropriate. And therefore, the access that one maintains to the spiritual realm, the infinite and eternal, the recognition of the importance of the perspective of the infinite is extremely important and not an easy one to do in the course of one's activity of attempting to make the world better, intervene, cause good to manifest. And ultimately, that's one of the reasons why I ended up choosing people in at least the professed spiritual community as my principal clients. Because I kept thinking that as long as they had that central to their way of being, that they could be less dangerous, with the full realization that they had in the past many times become very dangerous and damaging in light of that. So I found myself inside those particular institutions and communities, constantly warning them against their historical mistakes of being too authoritarian, and yet at the same time trying to goad them into being more active socially or horizontally than they were inclined to be, primarily because they had been burned in the past by being too much that way. So that's sort of how I've attempted, from an operational point of view, to try to take into account the warnings that you point out, and that people who are devoted to the vocation of philosophy have pointed out, some more turgidly than others, as you and I both know. But you can tell what it is they're saying in there. Mm-hmm. And so what I would like to open the discussion with is that if in fact one found a genuinely spiritually motivated community, do you think that there would be any appropriate role that they could play to intervene in the era in which they're alive and operative, that particular group of them, other than just being advocational and pointing out things to people that they ought to do or they think they ought to do? Do you think there's any proper role of them participating in affecting the tools of the state that are by definition coercive and backed by usually armed force? Or do you agree, for example, with John Paul II that prohibited all of the priests from participating in any way in politics? What is your sense of how a genuinely spiritual community with proper philosophical insight ought to conduct itself with regard to good and bad in the world, if there is such a thing?
It's a difficult question because it's hard to think about all these spiritual communities as being monolithic.
Sure.
Certainly, there's an enormous amount of diversity there. Whether or not one's normative sense of right and wrong derived from a spiritual condition can be funneled into the right and wrong secularly determined by the American state is a difficult act of translation, and one that I think that we should be a little bit suspicious of,
Mm-hmm.
I think. But I don't know that it's a foregone conclusion. And for me, the question would take on two forms. Is the act being taken by this spiritual community one that is meant to engineer an outcome in the state, so the alteration of policy and an alteration that one thinks is good or bad? Or is it an issue of the state granting a certain kind of refuge and distance to this community such that they can autonomously decide outside of the logic of the state what is good and bad? You know what I'm saying?
They've clearly been required, at least constitutionally, to do the latter. Mm-hmm. That was the kind of initial premise of the first of all the amendments in the Constitution, to actually make clear to the newly constituted government, federal government, that they were constitutionally without power to intervene in interfering with those folks engaging in that type of conduct, that advocational belief system, and espousing particular views, etc. Mm-hmm. The question that arose was the question of organizing, for example, in Europe, the classic Christian social democratic parties that organized, and they came to be viewed appropriately by the socialists as a tool of the capitalists. Mm-hmm. They somehow had intertwined the concept of capitalism and Christianity historically, and so that they were the rear guard of protecting the capitalist system. Now, I think that we're getting set to get a little new view of that from Francis. Mm-hmm. Francis is getting ready here in March to issue this new encyclical, and I think it's going to be radically critical of the capitalist system. Now, and he has I believe he's going to be in the he's welcomed Disucss back into the fold. Disucss was the foreign minister of the Sandinista government, who was a Catholic priest, and John Paul II, under the whip hand of Ratzinger and the Committee on Orthodoxy, had insisted that he be banned from his priestly functions because he was a government official. In at least, in word at least, not just because it was a socialist government, but because he was a government official at all. And now Francis has welcomed him back, has reauthorized him to engage in his priestly functions with full knowledge that he had been a government official. So I think that we're getting set, very interestingly, to get a look at this question of what, because I don't believe that Francis is going to rest with just espousing these things. Because if in fact the capitalists continue to maintain the kind of grip that they do on the tools of state power in the various countries of the world, I believe that he's going to be loosening the prior restraints on professed religious to engage in political activity, to potentially, for example, to promote and promulgate a natural law party, like we saw the transcendental meditation people undertake back in 1984, that whole thing. So I hear what you're saying, that you'd feel comfortable with the First Amendment restrictions on the state, not allowing interference in the spiritual communities advocating things. But let me repeat the question.
Okay.
What about the other side of that? Is there any way that you think that an organized spiritual community, selecting out from amongst all of the myriad ones there are, if one were to have a hypothetical bona fide spiritual community, do you think that there would be any legitimate role for them to play in actually participating in the utilization of the tools of the state to make the society better?
Yeah, but only as a covert activity. So one would have to clothe themselves in the flashy rags of state power only to advance an interest, a theologically weighted interest, which is contrary to the demands of the state. Because when you say state, I mean, I think we should contextualize this a little bit. There aren't a whole lot of different states out there. I mean, there's really just liberal democratic capitalism and then a couple rather meager holdouts. You know, so when you say state, I mean, we're invoking a whole range of ideologies that run contrary to the idea of organized religions, as I understand them. So there's something fundamentally incompatible about these two projects. I don't think that's a reason for all religions to become necessarily apolitical, as we would understand that term. But let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
If I were the state, you know, if we can say that the state is a personification, and I wanted to enhance the imperial agenda of the United States, for example, the first thing I would do when I came up against any kind of real religious diversity, and when I say religious diversity, I don't mean diversity as a value in and of itself, but diversity such that these religions do not like each other and think that one another are wrong, fundamentally wrong. And there are terms of toleration, of course, particularly in monotheism, but to overcome those differences, I would try to equate religion to worldview and flatten the differences between the two, such that diversity itself becomes a value. So the best thing the state can do is just promote all religions. And what it reduces religion to is a kind of secular conceit where you're free to worship in whatever way you choose, whatever God you choose, but really that freedom is only the freedom to vote and spend. And as soon as you start meddling with people's rights in terms of voting and spending, you become an enemy that can be vanquished. You know, so my question to you is, what is the relationship between religion and worldview? Can somebody's religion really be described as a worldview?
I think so. I do think so. And it is probably, however, a function of that aspect of the religious community that becomes an institution. The genuine spiritual practitioners who are the mystics and the meditators and the the poets, etc., have a particular role, but those who then start to institutionalize the religion and to undertake to propagate it and to promulgate it, intrinsically start to take on some of the vestiges of the same thing as the state, is an institution. And it's in those areas, I think, where the question arises, is what type of participation do they want to have with the state? And in almost all of these areas, the Catholic Church becomes, ironically enough, even though the Episcopal Church was founded by a state leader of Henry VIII, the Catholic Church becomes the kind of paradigmatic example of this long, prolonged relationship that they had with the Roman state, and taking on the role of missionaries for the cultural imperialism of Rome, and almost always the cardinal Archbishop of New York has almost always been linked to the military and to the kind of imperial venture of the United States that they've had. I think that the church or a spiritual community has an obligation to attempt to cause the state to engage in activity that not only leaves the space for practitioners and civilians and citizens alike to engage in the broadest possible range of free activity. But I think that they have an additional responsibility to take the steps that are necessary to get the state to exercise its power in a way that brings about some sort of ethical system. Now, the question arises as to whether or not any ethical system can actually be constructed without it being in reference to some worldview. Because my sense of it is that a mode of ethical reasoning is actually derivative of a particular worldview if it's systematized. If it's individuated, a person can move in and out of the beatific experience or a panenthetic experience and control her or his own personal conduct. But they tend to, and I would agree with you on this, they tend to, the more accomplished they are at that particular state of consciousness, they tend to engage less and less in trying to compel other people to engage in any type of conduct at all. I recognize that to be true. Because of my particular vocation, involved in public policy formulation and advocacy, my relationship with the spiritual communities has tended to be, in a certain sense, operational. Is that I deal with them on pretty much a horizontal plane, not a secular plane, however. I mean, because I'm somewhat adept at dealing with them with regard to the vertical plane, the vertical axis of their endeavor. But I think that a spiritual being will, when confronted by overarching evil or conduct that is so disharmonious to the enjoyment of life on the part of huge percentages of the population, will be morally compelled to engage in activity to attempt to affect the conduct of the state in a way that is at least one full step beyond simple advocacy. And as you've seen in some of the cases, the Catholic Church, for example, has gone to the point of organizing in South America, based communities, the Comunidad de Base, and cooperatives, active cooperatives that engage in the agricultural people, the peasants, organizing together and moving their commodities to market and holding them out of the hands of the capitalist oligarch, even though it's illegal, with full knowledge that it's illegal on the part of that particular state. And they have engaged in covert activities, not unlike the covert activities of some of the so-called intelligence communities of the nation states to attempt to effectuate change. I'm an advocate, at least at the initial point of our conversation here, of it being more above board. Yeah. And actively allowing, not necessarily requiring or certainly not compelling their professed religious to engage in political activity that could be, in a sense, representative of these values, and holding themselves open to being representatives of entire geographic regions rather than just ideas. But as you know, the entire kind of theater of elections are the strange blend of them holding themselves out as advocates of certain principles and policies, as distinct from just the kind of narrow, immediate self-interest of people within a narrow geographic region. So I would think that the candidates that I'm talking about would be more of the former kind, would just say, here, Dennis Kucinich type, here are the policy positions that I happen to actually believe are the best for our country and best for our people here, and I'm holding myself out as an available candidate, and if you would choose to have me represent you, I'd be happy to do it. It's going to start out as that kind of a thing, I would think. And the moving it toward, if it moves more and more toward a political party, you're going to find the temptation of that organization to move more and more toward the same kind of activities that the other political parties do, of taking polls and figuring out where they're and getting people to the polls and pulling your voters to the and all that stuff that they're going to do. So there's some happy spot along that spectrum, I think, where I would think that a genuinely spiritual community is going to be morally obliged to be practical about it in our day and age, our particular day and age, which I'm not sure differentiates itself entirely from previous days and ages when there was lots of strife and evil active in the world, that they're going to be required to take some more concrete, practical action. And in that sense, I think that they're going to have to be willing to risk the dangers, which are real, of formulating a worldview and conducting themselves in accordance with that worldview. And while not falling prey to the classic postmodern sin, if you will, remain more than just tolerant of other people's religious perspectives and worldviews, and move towards something like I was talking about, of thinking that the active worldviews along a particular political spectrum, being very active and assertive, can actually be healthy in manifesting certain aspects of human nature. If there can be a process that can be formulated that can integrate the dialogue of those particular views to come out with some kind of, well, not a consensus, some type of matrix, that is analogous to the lasers, setting up the kind of mutual interference patterns to generate some kind of a white light that could shine light on a policy solution.
You said a lot.
Yeah.
And insofar as you answered my question, I hear you hedging a little bit, that religions can be worldviews to the extent that their original theological origin solidifies into an orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And once, for example, Christianity becomes the Christian church, we can start to talk about it in terms of delivering a worldview. But I can only agree with you in a perverse way that, yes, of course, that's true, but we've only talked about the tipping point where a religion ceases to be worthy of the name, that it's just an orthodox structure. And now we're talking about a guaranteed economics of salvation. Do X, Y, and Z, and you can assure your spot in heaven.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that's necessary, but
okay. So what I hear you saying is religions can be worldviews to the extent that they're not actually religious; they're orthodox, which is a strange way to answer the question. But
I don't see that as the antipodes.
uh-huh.
I don't see that a spiritual community, as soon as it starts to become kind of some religious institution, inherently stops being religious, because the religious experience, the religare, that is so long as, and this is important support for your position, as long as that institution, in fact, instigates and promotes the genuine religious experience of their members,
Yeah.
as distinct from the kind of representational orthodoxy, and just says, you just do what you're told, we'll do the religious part of this thing. I think that's the kind of reforms that are going to have to be generated, for example, by Francis inside the Catholic Church, have to be along that line. And so that the idea of them necessarily collapsing into a completely kind of horizontal, secular, orthodox institution akin to the state, in alliance with the state in some concrete way. I think that they're mastering a method of instigating genuine religious experience on the part of their members, and somehow mobilizing them collectively to move in a way to try to discern policies with some legitimate leadership and guidance from those who spend more of their time doing that, is the way to prevent that type of collapse, that type of, reaching that tipping point and falling into being just an orthodox institution of some sort.
That said,
Yeah.
I'm very curious about the jump you made between that sort of religious orientation, providing a political framework, and then establishing on that basis a good or an evil. And this is something I'm very curious about in the way that you construct worldviews in general, and just providing a spectrum. Obviously, for probably at least 3 or 4 of those worldviews, you and I are evil manifest. Is there a hierarchy in these worldviews? Can that be determined? Or, and this is where we are awash in postmodern relativism, do we just openly tolerate everybody's worldview, and is that in itself the good?
Well, the answer to the latter is no. I don't believe that just everybody's worldview is to be tolerated. For example, but I mean, I don't.
On what basis do we make that decision?
Okay, well, that's the ultimate question. Is what type of, is there some universal referent in accordance with which one can make comparative normative judgments about worldview? And that's why I think this issue of consciousness is what I think is the operational principle here. And now that runs the risk of suggesting that.
But what do you mean by consciousness?
That's
Okay.
an unavoidable issue that we have to get to. I think that consciousness, as the Latin term suggests, is a way of knowing. It is a specific way of knowing, and I believe that, as I've suggested in a number of the talks, is that I believe that Crane Brinton is correct, not only in his suggestion that this is actually happening, that there is this stage of evolution taking place now in which a faculty is evolving in our human family, pursuant to which we can have direct and immediate experiential access to the unitive phenomenon that bonds every ultimate quantum field into harmonious whole. I believe that he's correct in pointing out, and it's a sad fact that he didn't take the time and energy to explicate the deity. He's saying that the greatest minds of our human family within the last 1,000 years have all come to sort of suggest this, that this is going on right now, whether they got biophysical about it or not. And so that I believe that the degree to which a given worldview acknowledges the bona fides of the genuine unitive experience, one is going to tend to migrate toward what I call the sixth paradigm worldview, the radical monist worldview, that actually uses almost a mechanical test for whether a particular form of conduct is harmonious or disharmonious to this kind of unified field. That becomes the operational referent. I see the principal distinction in important dialogue going on between that sixth paradigm radical monist experiential worldview and the seventh paradigm worldview, which professes to actually have access to a full step beyond. That it isn't just the kind of the totality of the physical universe that becomes your referent, your harmonic referent point, your tuning fork, in a sense. But they profess to have some access to the infinite and eternal, completely unconditioned consciousness that then starts to raise that fundamental challenge of quietism. That if you do access that infinite and eternal, what's the point of engaging in all of this other stuff? My sense is that this important discussion that needs to go on more between the sixth and seventh paradigm is going to be radically informed by the insights in science, in quantum physics, in the exploration of these points of harmony, this whole concept of the harmonious field, the unified field theory, as it were. So I think we're at a comparatively exciting period here in this dialogue, and I think we're going to be compelled to say that a worldview that emphatically denies the bona fides of any such experience, and therefore insists that there is no numinous realm, that there is no realm that is accessible by human experience that generates any sort of normative principle above each of us seeking our own immediate personal maximization of pleasure and minimalization of pain. I do think that we're going to have to be clear about the fact that while advocates of that particular worldview are perfectly free to advocate their worldview, if they begin to undertake conduct predicated upon it, which begins to inflict clear harm, discernible harm on others, that we as the collective have the right to move collectively and to enlist the power of the state to stop them from engaging in that particular type of conduct. And while that may sound simpler than it is, I think it does get us to the point where I would endorse the right to intervene on the part of not only a collective through some sort of due process, but even on the part of an individual having the obligation to intervene, to stop a particular form of conduct on the part of an advocate, a pure advocate of that particular worldview. So while that worldview, I think, functions and is driven by the root energy of the first chakra of immediate survival, physical survival being the kind of sole motive, the principal motive at least of that being, they cannot be allowed to engage in conduct that is injurious to others. And so that we get to that question of the source of the ought in the right. What is the source of the right that I have to intervene, other than my being able to inflict more physical strength against that person than they can inflict against me? Yeah. What do I have any other? Do I have any other asset or resource to bring to that which is ethical? And I believe that we do. And it's rooted in this issue of consciousness. Consciousness being the ability, in my judgment, to be able to experientially perceive a greater and greater and greater and greater scope and scale of reality. Okay? Now, this raises the question you raised is, well, does that eventuate in some sort of totality? And do you have a totality with reference to the infinite or the non-infinite, the finite boundaries of that reflected back into the system that gives you the answers to your questions, your questions of relative harmony and disharmony. So and I believe that it becomes extremely difficult, and it does for me, I know, that if you step beyond that into the infinite and eternal, and recognize that there is an infinite and eternal sea of completely undifferentiated consciousness that abides, that once one enters into that or drops the veils that one is consciously holding oneself apart from that you drop into that kind of oceanic experience of being that generates the danger of quietism. My sense of it, that a critique from the perspective of quietism is helpful to keep the state, keep the institutions, keep institutional religions, keep strong-willed individuals from engaging in appropriate conduct as a critique. But it's very difficult to function from that perspective and so I have a slightly different sense of ethics than I think I heard you saying, that ethics is intrinsically the process of attempting to relate to that infinite and eternal consciousness somehow, and only that is the true field of ethics. At least that's how I sort of heard you say.
That's certainly the foundation of ethics, but ethics itself, based on that foundation, just plays out in practical ways, almost banal ways. But you said quite a bit.
Okay.
Again.
Yes.
And I have a series of questions.
Okay.
So then you can say a lot again.
Yes.
So the first one is a sort of abstract philosophical question, and at least for me, I mean, I don't think this is a language game. It's important to hold on to the terminology. I mean, what you're describing isn't necessarily occurring on the level of consciousness, at least not consciousness as dictated by epistemology, forms of knowing. It's ontological. It addresses itself to being and not the rationalistic process of the mind. Why, if this is the worldview that relativizes the other worldviews, do we still call it a worldview? How could it be that, if it's the one that ranks the rest of the field? One question. Another question related to this. So you're using this unitive form of consciousness as a playbook for ethics. But my question would be, and a question raised by somebody who's taken a lot of psychedelic drugs, and also, has accessed oceanic consciousness in other ways, to be fair. My experience, ontologically rendered, is that oceanic consciousness doesn't have content. That's precisely what it is. It doesn't tell you to paint your car red, or bring your own bag to New York. It doesn't tell you any of those things. It is devoid of content. And if the point is just to say that all we really need to do is act in harmony with the universe and not be injurious to others, why not just call it pacifism and do away with all these intellectual gymnastics?
Well, as I'm saying, I don't, at least immediately, see the conflation between mere pacifism and a sixth paradigm radical monist worldview. That, you know, we have to obviously deal with the issue of Manichaeism, you know, that generated into that form of Gnosticism that believes that the entire material world is completely evil and fallen, and that therefore the only legitimate ethical conduct on the part of an individual is to disassociate oneself from it, and to rise out above it and to become an infinite and eternal being. You know, my sense is that to answer the first part of your question first, is that this schematic that I'm talking about of laying out these worldviews along the continuum of a rising level of consciousness, that is, as I said, one of the questions that I posed the other day, or last Friday, was that how do you set forth any kind of a schematic without implicitly having some worldview? That it's a lot more than just laying out other worldviews.
But isn't that just an argument against schematics?
Well, it's not necessarily, unless it's an argument against all worldviews. If the formulation of such a schematic inherently implies some worldview that you've got going, it's another worldview, and it may be kind of an overarching worldview. I think it's in a certain sense, a more helpful worldview than postmodernism,
But postmodernism, as I understand it, is the theory of worldviews and reducing being to worldview.
No, I'm not. Well, that's one of the questions we have to get to, is exactly what is postmodernism.
Yeah.
You know, when I said to the whoever the guy is the head of the philosophy department, I don't think postmodernism is a philosophy. You know,
I don't think postmodernists would consider postmodernism a philosophy, at least none that I know.
Well,
it's a toolbox, and it's one that you're using, as I understand it.
It's not. It's certain. I guess one could think I was, but to the extent to which I'm suggesting that if one is using the kind of the normative principle of ascending consciousness as your comparative referent,
it'd be different.
You actually get to a point where you get to that ultimate, the very question we're dealing with is in fact the ultimate end game here to become infinite, one and the same with infinite and eternal consciousness? Or is there a point at which the incarnate species, at least as far as we know, not just on this planet but other planets, incarnate species are some combination of access to that infinite and eternal, and yet a perspective, life that one has, and that there's some sort of balance between those things, that perfect solution to these things. And that's clearly where I think Catholic theology is going toward. It's trying to say that yes, there is a way to be walking in that state, and the same things with Hindu mystics and others. There is a way of being in the world and not of the world, or being in the world but not of the world. Mm-hmm. And that's the way they characterize it. Yeah. And my sense is that at least I've left open the refuge at the present time of there being this eighth paradigm that is one that is still beyond the event horizon. I'm avoiding kind of enshrining a seventh paradigm worldview as the ultimate objective that we're all going toward, is sort of getting to a point where we can access the infinite and eternal beyond the radical monad of the universe as our simply kind of almost Pythagorean harmonic referent point of the radical monads. But somehow accessing this, my experience, and this is talked about a lot, this thing of whether or not the oceanic experience, the panhellenic experience, whether it carries with it any kind of normative dimension at all.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably what caused William James to ultimately abandon that quest in the early phase of his work, to try to establish some kind of a mode of ethical reasoning predicated upon this type of, the bona fides of this type of experience. But the Buddhists spend a great deal of time writing about that, contrary to their suggestion that there's nothing really to be said about all of this. And it seems to me that that's the fruitful endeavor that philosophy at least ought to be engaged in a lot more than it seems to be. You know, really trying to plumb that question of, you know, can one retrieve any type of normative dimension from the panhellenic experience? Because they seem to be suggesting that the panhellenic experience is, those at least that acknowledge it as bona fide, has some sort of that mystical affect. It generates kind of mystical affect, causing a person to engage in certain kind of conduct. It seems like it would be possible to translate that into some sort of set of principles that one could at least advocate, if not compel, to other people. Because it seems clear that one can experience it. You know, the more one spends time in that particular dimension, the more clear it becomes to one operationally what is kind of uncomfortable and you know, not acceptable for you to engage in anymore. So that I would suggest that this panhellenic experience, when properly developed and integrated into one's life, could in fact generate a set of normative principles that the engaging of deriving middle axioms from these kind of premises, normative premises of the beatific experience or the panhellenic experience, to generate middle axioms, to translate these into, you know, whether you should paint your car red, etc. That one has to be guarded about what kind of specificity one can get into, but at least one can generate a range of options, it seems, that are available to people, and to leave those kinds of choices to people themselves, and you can get variations on that, which are all still consistent, I think, with the general normative principle, and a specific set of middle axioms that are derived from that, using one's intellect and rational faculties. And that's and I don't think that it necessarily drives one into kind of medieval scholasticism.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by
But
that?
that process that the Catholic Church engaged in back during the Middle Ages, where they basically superimposed upon every type of meditative experience some kind of scholastic specifics to it, in dictating conduct and what clothes you had to wear, how you tied your sandals, and all that kind of stuff. That's a major danger, the danger of totalitarianism. Again, so that would be my response, at least, to your two aspects to your question, I think.
Okay, so I think, you know, we're getting some real traction here, and it's important to clarify, particularly for the students, that even though you're invoking the category of worldview, which is certainly the province of postmodernism, you've embedded in your argument a certain kind of telos.
Yes.
There is a projection, a rising curve.
That's right.
And that creates a sense of difference, but also difference with meaning.
Yes.
Which is very important. So that's been clarified. Okay. And I think that, you know, was ambiguous,
okay,
to say the least.
Yes.
Let me just ask you a practical question about this process unfolding. So I'm sitting at my house, you know, I've engaged in a weird kind of incantation, or I've dropped some acid, or whatever. How do I distinguish between the universe speaking and the petty conceits of my own ego? When do I know, when one has accessed this oceanic plane of consciousness, that I'm receiving a directive? This relates back to the whole idea of, you know, does oceanic consciousness have content? And I wonder if you can just play it out. Because when I hear you say things like, act in harmony with the universe, do not do anything that is injurious to others, all I hear is the ethics of liberalism, which, no surprise, is the origin point for the worldview. So no accident that you arrived at that destination, because that was always the destination.
Oh, that wasn't my final destination.
Okay.
But,
But like,
yeah.
you know, and I can toy with these arguments, and we've been doing some of this.
Yeah.
In the sections, like,
you know,
as far as I understand, what is harmonious with the universe is the extent to which animals feel no shame eating and being eaten. You know, that we are a savage and bloodthirsty animal, and it is, you know, centuries of human civilization that has tried to distract us from that fact. But if we were really being harmonious with the universe as we understand the universe, we would be open to injuring others all the time, without fail.
So you're posing the Aquinas solution here, that as Aquinas pointed out, that when confronted by this particular question, he developed this entire theory that beings function in accordance with what is uniquely their nature, as distinct from the nature of a lion or a tiger or something like that. That human beings have a different nature, again, given the telos of the evolution of consciousness. With an increased level of consciousness, that type of conduct is not as natural to a being like that, because they would be able to sympathize and empathize with others whom they're hurting, because they would feel that. They would experience that.
Some of us do.
That's well, it'd be depending upon the level of consciousness. That's what I'm suggesting. Now, the real danger in this, of course, is the danger of theocracy. Is that, well, if you're setting up this kind of telos of an evolving set of worldviews, don't you eventually get to the point of having to acknowledge that there's a direct correlation between the level of consciousness that a person has and how much legitimate authority they ought to have in determining what goes on? Right? I mean, that's clearly going to arise.
Yeah.
And so that I believe that the solution of having a genuine democracy where people can directly express their opinions about what ought to be done, at the same time that they're engaged in this process of trying to evolve their own consciousness, will give you a reading of what the level of consciousness is within a given community, and what kind of choices they make. And that's the underlying theory, at least in the ideal, of democracy. Now, that I've been accused of being a liberal, but not usually for very long. I mean, after a few more questions.
Sense, not
no.
liberal. Yeah.
No, but what I'm saying is that I believe that the undertaking of activity to instigate people into practicing these kind of experiences, accessing these kinds of experiences, and I have a kind of an abiding faith, if you will, in that process, is that if that in fact is espoused and is instigated and is engaged in by a growing number of people, there will be a general elevation of consciousness of that community. And if you have a safeguarded process of democratic processing, of having them participate in the decision making for the community, that sounds pretty liberal as a process. But this radical position that I take, that is part of our constitutional fabric, that there are checks on the power of that majority to be able to make those kind of decisions. If they interfere in other people's individual rights, this is that classic aspect of the individualism in the liberal tradition, and that I do not believe that the source of those constitutional rights is either exclusively historical or in fact simply utilitarian and pragmatic on the part of the ruling class that kind of donated those rights to the people. That I believe that and I've said this to a number of courts, much to their distress, that I believe that these constitutional rights have been explicitly asserted on the part of the people as a full panoply of tools to be able to facilitate revolution. And so, don't look to me to be refraining from acknowledging that's part of the Constitution, because these were revolutionaries in a sense that helped put these things together. So there's the preserving of the revolutionary option on the part of the people to push back against those governing structures that become coercive and restrictive. And in a certain sense, that's not. In one sense, it's liberal, but in another sense, it's fairly radical. And that's sort of where I come out on this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just be a little bit more cynical about the nature of the state, especially the way in which that nature is described in the Federalist Papers and the idea of preserving minoritarian interests. Is it that the state really wants to keep alive the kernel of revolution that could ultimately lead to its own demise, or does it create a series of mechanisms by which that revolutionary fervor can be swallowed?
Oh, clearly does. I mean, there's no doubt at all that you're right, that the institutional dynamic is to suppress that, which is one of the very first lessons of the Constitution. It says, always beware that the state is always going to do that. You put the power into the hands of the state, and you delegate to individuals the power of the state, they're always going to be doing that.
Yeah.
So you have to be not only vigilant, but you have to be extremely aggressive and assertive of these rights, even in the face of people thinking that it's almost irrational what you're doing. I mean, the classic example we're getting now is, don't you think that we ought to have a government system of being able to do surveillance on people's emails and stuff? Because what if you have people who are child molesters? Don't you think we ought to allow the state to look for active activity at doing child molestation? The answer is no. It's no. They just, as a matter of constitutional authority, they don't have it. They don't have that kind of authority to invade that kind of private realm. And the consequences are that they have to have more effective law enforcement some other way. That's all. And I've held that position very radically down through the years, and have argued on behalf of the New York Times for the right not to reveal their sources, and et cetera. So I think in this particular case, I've not coincidentally been trained to look at this particular mechanism that we have set up here, to utilize it as the beginning operational model for how people can self-govern ourselves. And I have definitely adopted the warning given to us by the framers of always distrust the state, always beware of the state, always know that they're going to be doing it. Look for them to be doing this at every turn, because they will be. And because of that, I've been designated by various government agencies and officials, upon occasion I've heard, as not being a friend of the state. Sheehan is no friend of the United States, as one of the agency guys said. So, that's where I am at it. But there's this religious and theological overtone to everything that I'm talking about. That it's embedded deeply in these philosophical and theological questions that we're discussing here together, this whole mechanism of self-governance that we're working with, and how to improve it and make it work correctly.
I think that's a wonderful topic for next time too. And we'll try to develop some points of continuity so we can hit the ground running during the next conversation. One of those issues will probably be the extent to which revolution is even possible. I mean, I think about a lot of the wingnuts who live near my parents in rural Michigan who really do think that their 12 gauge is a check on government authority.
Right.
It's just like, well,
Right.
a curious argument to make in an age of nuclear weapons and tanks. You know, but that's just a small metaphor for the way the state has become a leviathan well beyond the imagination of our founders. And I think one of the profound things you've been doing in here in terms of providing our students a political education is showing them that the extent to which the government advertises itself as being transparent and giving you a voice and showing you how to manipulate the system, much of that is farcical.
Yes.
And it's incumbent upon a good citizenry to be able to parse fact and fiction when it comes to that. And you know, the other point of conversation, and I think this is something we're not going to resolve tonight, it's going to take many weeks. Have you seen The Big Lebowski?
Yes.
I refuse to believe, as the man sitting next to you up here, that the universe is smoky. You know? I don't know that the universe is smoky. I mean, say what you will, Professor Sheehan, about the tenets of National Socialism. At least it's an ethos. I mean, pacifism, fuck me. That's crazy. Okay, so, you know, when I drop acid, I don't hear Smokey. I hear other characters in that film for sure. But all of that said, so we'll have these talking points that give us signposts throughout the coming weeks, and you know, these conversations will be ongoing. But we also wanted to provide an opportunity for all of you to ask questions, if you like. And Elise, you had your hand.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because I am chomping at the bit.
Yeah.
This has been a really, for me, the juxtaposition, the questions are very, well, they're important to me. And they're important to me as an activist. And I feel like, honestly, I'm 55. This is the first time in my life, honestly, that I have gotten a real ethical discussion. But I feel there's a gap. And so I'm just going to go into that. When Danny is talking about something, it sounds like pangenetic experience on one hand, and finding, I think, and excuse my language, I'm just going to try to approximate, the normative, what I'm hearing is action that can come out of that, instead of just quietism, okay, and that is a referent, that this is possible. And Andrew is, on the other hand, juxtaposing his acid trip, and this, what I consider extraordinarily solipsistic, but
I was just providing an example of what Professor Sheehan was talking about.
I want to finish here because I find the vacuum here is that our educational system has not only encouraged but enforced, is that people have, unfortunately, an enormous dearth of consciousness experience until they're set loose at some point to go, you know, get a reprieve, smoke some pot, do some acid, because they have been given so much of this enforced institutional religion that's like you've been talking about, the medieval scholastics moderating the monks and all that. What I want to inject here is, you know, Martin Luther King was that. He was somebody who was accessing this pangenetic experience and saying, you know, I've been there, and I'm going to, boom, deliver it like a bowling ball here now. And what this looks like is exactly mobilizing a community to take very normative action. And this has happened so many times that I just want to throw out just some quick things. The abolitionists who came out of the transcendentalists, you know, often Quaker experience is just one. Gandhi and his group is another. But this, actually, I would say, this is quite a normative experience, in that many, literally millions of people, especially when you factor throughout history, whether it's nuns climbing on top of nuclear aircraft and dismantling it in communities, this going over and over and over again. And what Martin Luther King, I just happened to see a film today, so I'll end on this note, saying in the series Eyes on the Prize, he was with so many people, and they were talking over and over and over again about, this isn't just about Montgomery, this isn't just about all the blacks in the United States, this is about people of color throughout the world, and this is about freedom. but then boom, they would deliver it into very normative, actionable methods. And I think they discovered this often as they went, and it was at that particular moment, that moment happened to have a certain kind of perfection. And so it feels really, I think, in some ways untrustworthy, but I mean, I don't have time to cite the examples, but I'm loving the discussion because I really feel the Catholic Church, for example, as a deplorable institution that has turned into little, Nabisco wafers, the religious experience, and tried to control it so much. But on the other hand, you have the saints who over and over and over again, but even, have delivered this. St. Francis, absolutely turning the church around, being just another one. But what I'm really getting at here is do not think that this is something so rarefied and extreme as institutions like UCSC would love to have everybody believe. This is actually, the problem that we're having as activists right now is to say, there are so many people around the world who are engaging in activity from this level of, I have accessed such an infinite feeling that I am not really that concerned if I have to die, because my sense of meaning is so grounded in terms of a relational feeling with the other human. And yes, I do think this is a sociological referent at a certain point, and that is, it does embody a lot of subjectivity, but what I would really prefer about the ongoing discussion, because what would make it really much more interesting to me is that if you guys would start grounding your theories in terms of more inclusive of these types of people, because when you get into this language that is just so, the terms and the concepts are just so many words, I just think it would really, really, really help if you would kind of bring this stuff down into, because Andrew, I'm sure that you also have more to refer to than this one religious experience, which is dropping acid and everything's relative except
I've never dropped acid.
Well, whatever. I think we can all relate to that, but I'm saying...
Not dropping acid? We cannot all relate.
The acid, I've never dropped acid either, but
Yeah.
I think we can...
I dropped acid one time because I was handing it to
Good
someone.
for you,
and
I wish... I've done mushrooms and acid and all kinds of other things, but I'm just saying, I really think for this to be helpful, we need to ground it into some actual real, more human experience terms, because it just gets to be so many words.
Okay, we hear you.
All right,
We hear you.
thanks for listening.
Just a brief comment, really quick, and then we'll move on to other questions. I think, and I'm not making a criticism here, I'm just drawing your attention to the difference between the two. What Danny is referring to as this breach of oceanic consciousness, which creates a hierarchy of worldviews, is something altogether different than the ethics of MLK, who was a rather straightforward Christian and developing a sense of social justice out of that. Nothing wrong with it. And this is why he had to be put to death, later in his life a Marxist, believing that anti-imperial struggle was really the only way to address the ongoing racial tensions in the country. And I think once he crosses that bridge and the Marxist rhetoric gets ramped up and it's no longer about simple civil rights discourse, he has to go. And it's important, I think, to just note the difference between these two ethical formulations. This is one that is very much based on Christian teaching and the church, and then his later appropriation of Marxism, which has nothing to do with this breakthrough in terms of oceanic consciousness. And I don't raise the acid example as a kind of one-size-fits-all model for how one accesses the oceanic consciousness, but I was trying to find a real anecdote so we could make it concrete.
But I would
No,
say,
so
Andrew, I would say that
Yeah.
my MLK's thing is not the institutional version of Christianity, that it is much more the mystical thing, and I
One
think...
can be a social justice activist and still fully subscribe to the orthodoxy of the Christian church, I think. I mean, I've read the New
But
Testament
what
that way.
Father Dan Berrigan.
Yeah.
And guys, there's not any doubt when you talk with Dan at great length, he's an extremely spiritual being, and principally a spiritual being. And that when for example, when we struck down the anti-demonstration rules around the White House together, we all went in and sat down in the White House, and they arrested us all, and we all had this big trial. And when Dan Berrigan got on the stand to testify about why he had come to the White House to meet with people, because he wanted to meet with someone that represented the administration, to have him acknowledge to him that they were dropping butterfly bombs in Vietnam. There were these little bombs painted like butterflies with wings on them, etc., that were designed for children to pick up so that they would explode and blow their hands and arms off and blind them, but not kill them, so that the parents had to take care of them for the whole rest of their lives, to totally demoralize them. And when he got up to on the stand to talk about that, you could tell that this is a genuinely spiritual being who was there communicating this in concrete ways to a jury that we took right off the street without a single objection to a single person on the jury. Just put anybody you want in that box, you know, and we're going to tell them the story. And he did. And when I represented the American Sanctuary Movement down in Texas, down in Brownsville, when I got in front of the jury and started talking to them about Maria, who had fled from El Salvador, and I told you that horrible story, with the baby being put on the end of a bayonet and paraded around in a torchlight, etc. When you tell that story to human beings, the energy that starts to fill the room and the resonant energy is something real, and people in the spiritual community know what this is, and what we have to try to do is to figure out from a philosophical position, theological position, how we can identify this in some practical way, so that we can figure out how to get this inserted into the program at universities and in the academy, etc., and into the political discourse. And that's part of what we're talking about, trying to figure out how to do here.